Welcome to this panel, a civil society perspective. Really delighted to be able to join you today. So for the next hour, I will be joined in conversation with three colleagues of mine from two of the hats that I wear. I am Julia Sanchez, and I am the Secretary General of ActionAid International. So my colleagues Tinebeb, Berhane, Country Director of ActionAid Ethiopia, and David Archer, who works with us at the ActionAid International Global Secretariat, are joining me. And I'm also privileged and honored to be the chair of CIVICUS, and my colleague Mandeep Tiwana is joining us from CIVICUS as well. As I don't have to tell any of you, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought with it devastating and troubling news of impacts on health and then the economy, but also on a whole range of other issues that we at civil society are watching closely. These are not new issues, these are old issues that were already there, but that have become pronounced and more serious because of COVID-19. And that's what we're going to be talking to you about today. So we're going to hear from our three panelists, and then we're going to have 15 to 20 minutes to respond to your questions. So please use the Q&A space to send us your questions as you hear the different presentations, and we look forward to engaging in a dialogue with you. So the panel is called The Shadow Pandemics of COVID-19, and we're going to focus on three which we feel are particularly important to watch and understand. So first of all, gender-based violence. Second, a crippling debt or the austerity climate. And third, the attacks on civic space more generally. And each one of my colleagues is an expert, a global expert on these issues, and we'll be giving you highlights of what we're observing, what we're recording, and some of the changes or actions that we believe as civil society need to happen in order to address these shadow pandemics. So first of all, let me just quickly tell you, ActionAid, for those of you who do not know us, is a global federation of 30 members and 16 country programs. So we're in about 50 countries, working for a world free from poverty and injustice. And you can find more information on ActionAid at actionaid.org. And CIVICUS is a global alliance of civil society organizations and activists dedicated to strengthening citizen action and civil society throughout the world. And more information on CIVICUS and its work can be found at civicus.org. So first, I'm going to invite my colleague Tinebeb Berhane, who is the country director of ActionAid Ethiopia. And ActionAid Ethiopia promotes and works towards ensuring gender justice, good governance, and poverty eradication in Ethiopia. She has over 23 years of experience in development, and she is a recognized civic leader and is currently vice president of the Ethiopian Civil Society Council that represents more than 3,000 organizations across Ethiopia. Tinebeb, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Julia, for this opportunity to talk about the impact of COVID on gender-based violence, which is a living reality of our communities. I'll try to address this very vast topic in the next 10 minutes. Violence against women is widely recognized as a global pandemic that affects 1 in 3 women. Most offenders were known to the victims. Research conducted in Ethiopia, for example, indicated that this includes 30% are neighbors, other community members compose 30%, and other friends are 24%. A study conducted in 6 Saharan countries by the UN and Africa Union in 2020 showed that domestic violence, whether physical or verbal, increased from 40.6% before the COVID-19 crisis to 52.2% during the pandemic crisis, a rate of increase of 12%. Chad, Senegal, and Mali recorded the increase of 30%, 14%, and 10% respectively, while Burkina Faso, Mauritania, and Niger having less than 10% increase. The same research indicated that due to pandemic-related disruptions in prevention programs, it is estimated that globally 2 million female genital mutilation cases could occur over the next decade that would otherwise have been averted. Efforts to end child marriage can be disrupted by COVID-19 pandemic, which could result in additional total 13 million child marriages taking place that otherwise would not have occurred between 2020 and 2030. Violence by an intimate partner was reported by more than 40% of women in Eastern Africa countries such as Burundi, Kenya, Mozambique, Zambia, and Zimbabwe in the last 12 months, according to the report released by sources in 2021. Looking at some countries, in addition to that, in North Africa, for example, in Algeria, several cases of femicide have been committed since the beginning of the year. The incidence increased in the context of the confinement, with a murder occurring every 3 to 4 days. In Egypt, another example, there was a 19% increase of violence against family members linked to strict measures being implemented to limit the spread of COVID-19. In South Africa, official reports show that within the first week of level 5 lockdown, South Africa Police Service received 2,320 complaints of gender-based violence. These statistics represent a 37% increase from the weekly average of South Africa gender-based violence cases reported for 2019. In West Africa, again, Liberia, records show that a 50% increase in GBV, while in Nigeria, recording from 24 states across the country show that the number of reported incidents of domestic violence spiked by 56% during the first 2 weeks of April compared with the same period in March, after lockdown measures were enacted on 31st March. In Lagos State, cases of domestic violence have surged by over 100% during the lockdown period. Given its gravity, the lockdown imposed in many countries in response to COVID-19, whilst necessary, has prospect of increasing women's vulnerability to violence. Many women are currently locked down with the abusers in their own homes, and restrictions in the movement make it even more difficult to seek assistance or at least obtain information on service available. Furthermore, a strong correlation has also been established between violence against women and economic advancement. A loss in income in the home, in the household, has the potential of escalating violence because there is a huge stress in the economic and in means of income at the household level. Lockdown and social distancing considerations have also proved to weaken social networking among women and erode their efforts to responding to violence against women. The COVID-19 pandemic is occurring against a backdrop of increased humanitarian needs within the region, within Africa, due to back-to-back drought, famine, flood, locust upsurge, conflicts, terrorism, and lack of humanitarian access in the region, which will in turn exacerbate existing vulnerabilities. Therefore, understanding the in-depth magnitude of the problem of gender-based violence, we have asked to states, ask number 1, a holistic human rights-based Africa-wide response framework that include urgently developing a holistic and inclusive strategy for COVID-19 response, taking unique particularities in Africa, and also ensuring inter-border actions aimed at preventing, treating, and managing the pandemic are well coordinated, void of human rights violations, as well as advocating for inclusive implementation of COVID-19 response measures in all countries, bringing on board all relevant players. Our ask number 2 is on preventing and guaranteeing violence-free environment for women with clear political statement from all member states that violence against women will not be tolerated and also clarity on services available to survivors of violence during this period, including details on how this can be accessed, as well as financial support to women organizations, non-profit and community-based organizations, providing preventive, mitigate actions and crucial services to survivors of gender-based violence. Our ask number 3, strengthening immediate response measures with strong social safeguards that includes giving a special attention to women and girls living in vulnerable contexts, such as a formal or informal refugee camp, prisons, and migrant centers, as they are most likely to be excluded from raising awareness campaigns, increased stress and potential risk. We also ask governments implement national disaster management interventions. There need to be a responsive to the gender needs, interests, and priorities of women, men, and gender non-conforming persons. Women must be part of the decision-making process on the identification of measures to respond to COVID-19. We also ask widening social protection programs and call for depoliticizing of the scheme across Africa to ensure all people benefit, as in some contexts in Africa, social protection is heavily politicized on the partisan basis. Our ask number 4 is advancing for accountable human rights-based response to COVID-19, where coordinated fast-tracked accountable mechanisms for states and other agencies to report on progress made and premise actions that slow the pandemic. Also, deliberately strengthening the civil society and citizen-led accountability platforms to enable oversight on COVID-19 response, especially in the period of curfews and lockdown, as well as equally important will be actions to ensure that COVID-19 response respect human rights, address the gendered impacts on the pandemic, and response to the needs and rights of vulnerable groups. Here, engagement of the law enforcement agencies to curb excess in enforcement of movement restrictions and other conditions established by government is very crucial. Civil society groups and the media should be supposed to monitor, document, report, and engage on human rights, gender equality, and promotion of positive communication on COVID-19. Our last ask is justice on people's vaccine for COVID-19, where we call upon pharmaceutical companies openly share their technological know-how to make their vaccines available, and governments suspend patent rules on vaccines and health technologies during the pandemic and avail the vaccines to countries in global south, as we believe we are not protected unless we all are vaccinated. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tinebeb. Very stark numbers that you've shared with us. And I think on my radar, this was the first crisis that we started talking about in terms of a shadow pandemic, because it was so immediate, the impact of COVID and the restrictions on, confining people at home, as you said, but also incapacity of people to continue pursuing their livelihoods, and the diversion of flows to support services for women who are affected or in situations of gender-based violence. All of that got cut off. And so it's really been quite alarming to see that impact across Africa and honestly across the world. I'm sitting here in Canada, and we've had this very live conversation here about how the rates of domestic abuse have also been going up because of COVID. So thank you for sharing that with us, and for the very clear and specific asks that have been put together by civil society actors to address this shadow pandemic. As you highlighted at the end, a people's vaccine equity is so fundamental to address the underlying causes that are putting women in a more vulnerable situation at present. So thank you so much for that. And thank you for keeping to time so brilliantly. So my next panelist, my colleague Mandeep Tiwana, is the Chief Programs Officer at CIVICUS, the Global Civil Society Alliance. He specializes in legislation relating to the core civic freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. Since joining CIVICUS in 2008, Mandeep has engaged in efforts to advance civil society participation in decision-making and to protect civil society freedoms globally. He has written extensively on the intersection between civil society, sustainable development, and international affairs in this capacity. Mandeep, over to you, please.
Thanks, Julia, and many thanks to the organizers of the Karl Polanyi conference. I'm very happy to be here. My remit today is to talk about COVID-19 and civic space. So I just, before I share some of our reflections from CIVICUS, I just wanted to reflect a little bit on what is civic space. And essentially, civic space is the ability to organize, to come together, to express ourselves, to shape the political, economic, and social structures around us. So it's predicated on three freedoms, which we call the core civic freedoms of association, peaceful assembly, and expression. These are part of the constitutions of almost every country. They are also a part of customary international law and well protected by a vast body of international judgments and international legal texts. Yet they remain contested, and I'm going to speak a little bit about that. And as I'm sure many of the participants at today's meeting know, that civic space is facing some serious challenges. And there are three particular challenges that we are concerned about. One is, over the past few years, we found that there seems to be a rise in authoritarianism. So on one hand, you find there are old school authoritarians, people who've been in power for a very long time. They've rigged the whole governance system and rigged elections and sort of given the, and control all the levers of power. But we've also seen a new breed of populist authoritarians who have come to power through electoral politics. So they create division in societies. They usually promote a very xenophobic, nationalist, othering approach towards minorities. And they come to power on the basis of electoral politics, yet they claim to speak in the name of democracy, which is a zero-sum game, 51% democracy, and not care about the others. And they sort of undermine constitutional values and principles. So we are at the moment seeing this toxic mix of old school authoritarianism and right-wing populism. So, and some of these leaders are exemplified as in countries like the Philippines, countries like Hungary, countries like Brazil. And they don't like anybody who exercise the power of democratic dissent against them. So they don't like those who speak truth to power, particularly civil society organizations or members of the political opposition who challenge their concentration of power. But civic space is also being challenged by another challenging situation in our societies, and perhaps David will also be speaking to this later. It's the inequality that's part of the economic systems in our societies. So we have seen over the past couple of decades a real concentration of economic power in the hands of a few, and the consolidation of corporate power and searing inequality. So organizations, activists, journalists that expose high-level corruption, that expose these corrupt power relationships or collusion between political and economic elites, are also facing some serious challenges. And lastly, the third big issue in relation to civic space challenges is a rise in xenophobia, a rise in politics of exclusion, in politics of hatred. So there's been a rise in movements, which are based on very aggressive xenophobic nationalism and patriarchal values. And Tinebeb spoke about some of the gender justice challenges and domestic violence spiking during COVID-19, but they're also part of this aggressive, toxic masculinity, which is promoted through xenophobic and nationalistic tendencies in society. So these people, they attack those organizations that seek to promote social justice, that seek to promote inclusive values, that speak in favor of LGBTQI communities, that speak in favor of equal rights irrespective of gender, and or speak in favor of rights of disadvantaged communities and minorities in particular. So together, these challenges are of course, hanging over civic space and the true exercise of democratic values in our societies, which allow people to be part of the decisions that are impacting their lives. And our research at CIVICUS, the Global Civil Society Alliance, finds that 87% of the world's population do not live in countries where there are very serious restrictions on the freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. This is through a participatory platform that we support with 20 regional and international civil society organizations, which is called the Civicus Monitor, and we cover all countries in the world. We cover all UN member states plus Palestine, Kosovo, and Taiwan. And we find that in our research that in 25% of the world, 25% of the world's population, they actually have no civic space. And there's a vast swath of countries stretching from China to Cuba, and a heavy concentration in the Middle East and North Africa region, from Egypt to Saudi Arabia to Iran to Iraq, further up Turkmenistan and to Uzbekistan, and also in some sub-Saharan African countries like South Sudan, Central African Republic, Eritrea, where just the mere act of criticizing the leaders who are in power can land you in jail or can get you killed and can get your family persecuted and attacked. So that remains a big challenge. It remains a big blot on our societies today, that despite all the technological progress and the wealth creation we have achieved, we still have these medieval systems of power where people are not allowed to even express their views openly or allowed to make changes that could make our governance more inclusive, more humane, and better and less corrupt. So in the context of COVID-19, as it happened with inequality, as it happened with gender-based violence, as it's happened with exclusion, civic space challenges have also exacerbated. And three issues have particularly come to fore and which are of serious concern to us. One is that, as we found in the early days of the pandemic, many governments wanted to put their best foot forward. So they started to censor information. So a lot of censorship was carried out, including instructions given to media organizations not to report on the pandemic, not to create fear in societies. In some places like China, of course, information was scrubbed off the internet about the spread of the virus. In other countries like Vietnam, people who were criticizing the government's response on social media were summoned to police stations and threatened. And this censorship remains a big challenge, and it remains a big challenge to the data about what really took place, but also about the information on the basis of which our leaders were taking decisions that were impacting people's life and were leading to a large number of deaths and their livelihood, and also they were impacting their livelihoods. So that was a big challenge in relation to civic freedoms in COVID-19 that came to the fore, this ramping up of censorship. Now, the ramping up of censorship also went hand in hand with surveillance. So an increase in surveillance infrastructures. And again, of course, under the benign overarching term of, we need to have information about the virus spread. We need to be able to control the virus, as public safety and civil liberties, were sought to be balanced. And a number of contact tracing apps were established. And in our research, we remain concerned about contact tracing apps in countries like Israel and Singapore, which could have far-reaching ramifications on people's ability to be able to act with privacy, but also particularly challenging for those who may be critical of the official dispensation. So that is another big challenge that came to the fore. And the third is a ramping up of coercive capacities of law enforcement agencies. As you might know, that emergency measures were introduced in many countries. There was lockdowns, and police were, and other government, military forces and other security forces were given powers to enforce lockdowns. And we found that there were lots of attacks and coercive actions by them. In Kenya, lethal force was used. In countries like India, police rounded up people and and made them do all sorts of physical punishments for in the name of violating the pandemic. And this is a serious issue. And then we found that, COVID-19 really is almost like a momentous world event, which is ramifications across the world. And after 9/11, we found that torture and extraordinary renditions were normalized. And there's a fear that censorship and surveillance and coercive capacities of law enforcement agencies might be something that would linger, long after the impacts of COVID-19 have left our societies. But nevertheless, I do want to emphasize that, despite all these challenges and despite all the restrictions on civic freedoms, people continue to mobilize. And one of the most significant mobilizations that happened last year was the Black Lives Matter mobilizations around the world, which of course had the epicenter in the United States, but spread to many parts of the world and really, reinvigorated calls for racial justice and of course led to the overturning of a racist and divisive president in the United States. And also, overcoming voter suppression. So people continue to mobilize. In Brazil, when government mismanagement has taken place and continues to take place, people actually started to put crosses in front of government buildings to show, that how dissatisfied they were with the callousness of the government. There've been mobilizations for women's sexual and reproductive rights in Poland. In Argentina, through public mobilizations, in fact, landmark legislation has been introduced to protect women's rights over their own bodies. People have continued to mobilize, and of course, in stealing of elections and also the actions of authoritarian leaders in countries like Russia and Belarus and Uganda, people have still come out in the streets because of the intransigence of their leaders. And in India, there's a massive protest by farmers against corporate overreach, coupled with high-level collusion between political and economic elites, and which has continued despite the COVID-19 pandemic. But just to end, I would just say that civic freedoms are a very important part of our governance discourse. And they are also an important part of the sustainable development understanding. In 2015, we had Agenda 2030, which has a list of 17 sustainable development goals, which for the future change the definition of development merely being as a top-down poverty alleviation approach. It actually brought in an element of civic freedoms and rule of law and about fundamental rights for people to be able to shape the societies around them. And I think that is something we need to continue to emphasize, because we are facing a Cold War scenario where there's governments that don't believe in democratic values are trying to say, trying to create a false dichotomy between economic and social and cultural rights and civil and political freedoms. So we need to continue to emphasize there cannot be sustainable development without civic freedoms. There cannot be peace without justice. And we need to be able to focus on democracy and civic freedoms if we are going to have better, fairer, more equal societies that are there. We also need to ramp up our investments in democratic institutions. Yes. Do I have 30 seconds or I'm out of time? Okay.
Please wrap up.
Okay. All right. And we also need to ramp up our investments in democratic institutions, particularly in judiciaries and national human rights institutions, as they support activists and organizations that support civic freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mandeep. Thank you for that overview. I love some of the terminology that you're using to describe the situation that we face. And I think it's important what you were emphasizing, that things were already not in a good place. They were in a worrying place. They're sliding backwards with the impact of COVID. And there's some issues that we really need to keep our eye on if we don't want to have a post 9/11 normalization of these spaces that have closed or narrowed for civic space. But the hope that what has been happening with Black Lives Matter and in other social mobilization brings to us. So thank you so much for that. So we're going to invite David, our last speaker, and then we'll be going to any questions that our participants have. So we have one question in the Q&A, but please do enter any questions that you might have so we can address them afterwards. So my colleague, David Archer, is Head of Participation and Public Services with ActionAid, building collaborative work across the Federation on civic participation, tax justice, and gender-responsive public services. He is the co-founder and until recently a board member of the Global Campaign for Education, chair of the board of the Right to Education Initiative, and chair of the Strategy and Impact Committee of the Global Partnership of Education. And he's been leading a lot of the work that we've been doing at ActionAid, looking at the impacts of COVID on public spending, on debt, on in the climate of austerity that we had before the pandemic, but of course has also been aggravated. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Tinebeb and Mandeep as well, for laying out the different ways in which COVID has exacerbated existing crises. And I'm going to talk about how COVID's exacerbating what I think was a pre-existing crisis of debt and of austerity. But there really are alternatives, and we can still use this as a moment, as a turning point to build stronger, more effective and responsible states. So let's look at the big picture first of all. I mean, the COVID crisis has had a dramatic impact on economies around the world. Per capita income has fallen in 170 countries. GDP fallen by about $12 trillion around the world, and that has a knock-on effect on the tax revenue that is collected by countries, and therefore on the capacity to spend on public services. I spend a lot of my time in the education world, and the estimates are that about $200 billion will be wiped off education budgets around the world over the coming year. But to be clear, these challenges are a sort of exacerbation of what were ideologically driven underfunding of public services that stretches back over 40 years, premised on this view that of a minimal state and the encouragement of privatization of different services. So I'm going to say a little bit about debt, a little bit about special dwelling rights, and something on austerity and tax. First of all, I mean, there was a pre-existing debt crisis, much less visible than the one that many of us remember at the end of the 1990s and into the early 2000s. But this was becoming serious even before COVID. You've got 64 countries back in April of last year who were spending more on debt servicing than they were on their public health systems. You've got, we did a comprehensive research across low-income and low-middle-income countries, and we found that half of them were spending more than 12% of their national budgets on servicing debt, and that those countries who were at that level, spending over 12% of their budgets on debt, had cut back spending on essential public services over the previous 3 years, and often to quite over 10% cuts in spending on public services. So there's a very close correlation between indebtedness and cutting back on services, and in some countries really very acutely high levels of debt servicing, countries like Ghana, Zambia, Pakistan, where debt servicing pretty much takes up over half of the national budget. That's disastrous. Now, there's been a lot of trumpeting of a big new debt initiative, this debt service suspension initiative initiated by the G20. But frankly speaking, it's peanuts at the moment. It's a few $1 billion. It's really not doing anything seriously to address the longer term crisis. The debt is only suspended to the end of this year. It's not reaching all of the countries that need it, and is not covering all of the debt, all of the creditors who need to be included, particularly private banks. So it's actually a very limited use so far. There's a very big demand, though, for a much wider debt cancellation and debt renegotiation, and a really serious need to look at debt in a wholly new way, look at new ways of ensuring proper parliamentary oversight when new debts are taken out. And I do think there's more momentum on debt and some progressive solutions being proposed now than was the case before. So there's some source of optimism now. One of the other big initiatives that has been announced recently is the issuing of special drawing rights by the IMF. This is sort of putting liquidity back into the global economy as a serious response to this crisis. But the consensus at the moment is only about $650 billion will be issued in special drawing rights, and the vast majority of that goes to the richest countries. In fact, about 1% of that ends up in low-income countries. And although some mechanisms are there to reallocate, redistribute the money that goes to the richer countries, it ends up coming to the lower income countries in the form of loans and actually contributes potentially to a negative cycle. There's a big demand to put $3 trillion on the table in special drawing rights, and that's the sort of money that would be serious. For example, for sub-Saharan Africa, that would get to about $50 billion, which starts being at the level which makes a difference at the moment. Something like $37 billion is leaving Africa every year in debt servicing. So we really do need to be looking at solutions on that sort of scale. One of the fundamental problems with the level of indebtedness is that it actually profoundly empowers the IMF, because the IMF is the lender of last resort. And the IMF has been ramping up the issuing of COVID emergency loans around the world over the last year, and seems to be very generous in giving out those loans. But if you look at the conditions attached to the loan, what they're saying, these are very unconditional loans, but they do extract a commitment from every country that gets a COVID emergency loan, a commitment to return to fiscal consolidation within a short period of time. And when the IMF talk about fiscal consolidation, we need to hear the word austerity. And a very large number of countries are being encouraged to make commitments to go back to austerity even before the end of this year, which is absolute madness and would actually exacerbate the situation seriously. We have had many, many years, a pandemic of austerity going back probably 40 years. It's, we did a review of all of the IMF loans and policy advice to low-income countries and to lower middle-income countries last year. And we found one of the perhaps most startling statistic is the pressure that the IMF puts on the spending on public services, and particularly on public sector workers. So the policy advice from the IMF in 78% of countries over the last 3 years was to cut or freeze your spending on public sector workers. Now, the IMF try to give the impression this is about cutting back government bureaucracy, but the vast majority of people on the public sector workforce, the two largest groups, teachers and health workers. So it's nurses, doctors, teachers, frontline care workers. These are the people employed on the public sector wage bill. And if you have to freeze or cut it, however much the IMF say we don't want to have a negative impact on health or education, the effect is to freeze spending on frontline workers. In fact, it's the most routinely used piece of policy advice in 103 countries, according to a latest study by Isabel Ortiz, were encouraged to cut back their spending on the public sector wages. And in some sectors like education, you simply can't spend more if you don't spend more on your frontline workforce, because like 90% of education budgets around the world go on paying teachers. So you can't expand spending on teachers if you're faced with those squeezes. So we really need to push back on this in a very serious way. And there are clear alternatives. And every time the IMF recommends austerity, we need to be saying, well, the alternative is clear. We need to expand tax revenues in a progressive way. Now, there's some momentum on this. The IMF is beginning to come around to the need to recommend expanding tax revenues. In fact, they estimate that most countries could expand their tax to GDP ratio, which is a key measure of the amount of money countries collect in tax, could expand them by 5% within a medium term, say 3 to 5 years. So the average low-income country at the moment collects 16% in tax, has a ratio of 16% tax to GDP. Within 5 years, that could go to 21%. Countries that expand their tax to GDP ratio at that rate can actually double spending on all essential public services. You could double the health budget, double the education budget, double spending on water and sanitation, because the amount of revenue that's collected in taxes is the pivotal measure. The question is how to achieve that. Do you do it through more VAT, which then passes the burden on to many of the poorest people in society, or do you do it by progressive taxes, which look at corporate tax, income tax, wealth taxes? And one of the very interesting things about this moment is the growing consensus that there needs to be action on corporate tax. So there is now, we've got the US Treasury and the IMF chief economist last week coming out in support of a global minimum rate of corporate tax. Now, the rate may be set lower than we would like. We would like it to be 25%. The consensus at the moment is around 21%. But that would transform the capacity to extract. It's a form of progressive tax. Question is, where will that tax be collected? At the moment, it's likely to end up in the US or in the headquarters countries of big multinational companies, rather than in a redistributive way to the countries where many of those big companies are actually making their profits. You look at the users for Microsoft, for Google, for Facebook, increasing the users in the South. The users are the big resource of these big knowledge-based companies, and the tax needs to be redistributed. But there are possibilities. So if we're going to change this, I'm going to move towards conclusion. We need to build pressure from the bottom up on ministries of finance in every country to start resisting the IMF policy advice, to recognize its ideological nature, and instead of austerity and the squeezing of public services and the privatization of those services, start looking at putting a strengthening and a rebuilding of public services at the core of rebuilding a viable state post-COVID and in the context of the climate crisis. If you don't have a comprehensive government capacity to look at provision of services, there are some of the challenges of the climate crisis that are upon us that are going to be very difficult to handle effectively, because it is about governments regulating the corporates, big corporates, and playing a redistributive role, going back to that fundamental conception of the state as a redistributive actor, both in how it collects revenue through taxes and how it spends revenue in gender responsive public services and in universal social protection. So there are, I think, possibilities still. There's more radical ideas on the table today than there have been over the last many years. And I think that this could still be used as a turning point, but we really need coordinated pressure from the bottom up on these global institutions. And in every country, in every state, I think it's a battle to ensure that we seize this opportunity to explore feminist, green, just alternatives. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. So to the participants in this panel, you can see why I love my work. I get to work with amazing people like Tinebeb, Mandeep, and David, who are feeding their advocacy and activism with data and very sound analysis. And I'd like to pick up on the point that David made, that we have an amazing opportunity to push forward in new and bigger ways agendas that we've been working on for a very long time in civil society. We've been pointing to these structural issues of inequality, of authoritarianism, of the, as David said, the ideologically driven underfunding of public service, or the austerity agenda. We've known that these were the underlying problems that were inhibiting growth and global justice. And this pandemic has definitely emphasized, is shining a light on that. And yet we see, of course, that the forces that promote those agendas are also doubling down. So, it's a very, we're in a big fight, and definitely need to join forces around this. Civil society, researchers, academics, progressive political parties, we all need to put our efforts together to fight back and make use of this opportunity where things are becoming so increasingly clear. And as David said, we're seeing talk of things that, just a year ago seemed impossible to hear about, wealth tax, and all of a sudden, IMF and others are talking about this. So I think there is a recognition that we're in a dire situation. So we have a little bit under 15 minutes to entertain some questions. And so I'm going to invite my colleagues to both answer a question, but also, if you would like, pose a question to one of the other panelists. So we're going to start with Tinebeb. There's a question from Francisco Bosano Barnes. Hi, Francisco. And his question is around the electoral debates that have been canceled in the regional autonomous community in Ethiopia because of death threats. So it addresses some of the issues that Mandeep was talking to specifically, but of course, the Tinebeb is living through in Ethiopia and observing closely. So how can we promote mutual aid in defense of democracy? So I'll invite Tinebeb to come in first, and then maybe Mandeep to also complement that. And you're in Spain, Francisco, yes, good. Tinebeb?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Julia, and Francisco, for the good question. It's a very big question, but I will try to respond in a very pragmatic manner. First of all, I'm happy that our situation in Ethiopia is getting a lot of traction globally. It is a very complex situation. This is a very big nation with a very complex society fabric. So there's no easy fixing of whatever happening now. But number one, I think it is important to continue empowering our people at the country to support, people's struggle. The people are in the struggle of the democracy. Currently, we have 20 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. I think it's very important to continue to provide the humanitarian assistance to our people. Secondly, flexibility over various, sanctions that might be laid by different governments. I don't think it will help countries like us because it impacts the communities, empowerment, communities' need who are already in crisis. If this not happen, this encourages more restricted civic space and also the rise of autocratic government. That's how we see it. Certainly more funding provisions to civil society organizations, because we know there is a growing tendency of bilateral relationships that governments are giving billions of dollars to governments, where accountability mechanisms are not laid out and conditions are not straightforward in terms of human rights issues and other aspects that's really compromising daily lives of people living in poverty. So supporting civil society organizations who are already part and parcel of this democratic process is quite substantial, it's important. And fourthly, influence government and have constructive engagement to listen and respect the peoples and respond to their questions instead of politicizing everything that has been really going on at the ground, and realizing people's power is very, very important because change is in the hands of our people. And fifth is strong support to the country in the transformation of human rights and democracy institutions that are really struggling at this point in time. And that is very important to ensure the rule of law and civic freedoms and respect to the rights of the people. And finally, if requested, because that is normally internal matter, support to fundamental solutions. That is, in my opinion, is constitutional revision and ethnic-based federalism that really triggering conflicts in country and across the region as well. So having this kind of lanes and support, continuous support, and not to give up on us is very important, to build our nation. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Tinebeb. And I think one of the interesting things about this pandemic is that it has shown us, as we were saying earlier with the gender-based violence, I made a comment of how I've seen that play out in Canada as well, that these these trends and these worrying aggravation of restrictions on democracy, economic, social, and other are reflected at different degrees in all parts of the world, right? So I know Francisco's writing to us from Spain, and he has Spain in mind of what's happening there. So I want to invite Mandeep maybe to pick up on what Tinebeb was saying and speak to that kind of global trend that we're observing as well.
So I think, the principles that Tinebeb laid out in ensuring a free and fair election apply across the world. They're equally about rule of law, about ensuring this, the integrity of democratic institutions, of ensuring a free and empowered civil society, so that the people's mandate and will can be upheld, and those who promote, hate or those who promote ways to intimidate the electorate can be kept at bay. So those remain the same, in every part of the world, and that's important. Well, one learning that we have from our work at CIVICUS, especially with regards to election integrity, is that free and fair elections happen not just on the 4 or 5 days when elections happen, or in the case of India, when they happen over the course of months, a few months. It's not about just them having electoral observers and having electoral institutions ensuring that the balloting is done properly, but it's a long continuum process. It means that you actually have the right conditions. You have a media that's able to report, with credibility, credibility, and also media that's able to report without intimidation on what's going on. You have civil society that ensures that there's no voter suppression, that people are able to cast their mandate, and you also have institutions that ensure that constitutional values and principles are being upheld. And sometimes, as it happened in the case in the United States, democratic institutions, after a president in power an ex-president in power tried to intimidate election officials into overturning the results, democratic institutions and the judiciary stood firm, and election officials expressed their loyalty to the Constitution rather than the political executive of the day. So all of that is, I think, important, and that applies, in the case of Spain or Ethiopia, of which neither of those countries I'm an expert in, but that certainly remains constant.
Thank you so much, Mandeep. So I'm going to invite David to come in. There are a couple of questions, comments on what he was speaking to around the IMF conditionalities and their push for austerity and fiscal responsibility. So Margie was saying, back to the future, despite the deep crisis and the impacts of COVID. And then Maria was saying, how optimistic can we be at this time? You already said it depends on bottom-up struggle, but would that work? Can you elaborate a bit? So David, back to you. I mean, this conference has been focusing on the role of the state. And so I think it's good for us to end our panel thinking about, the state and the pressures that are put on states everywhere. And this is, true. This ideology of austerity is we're observing it everywhere, and it's limiting states' capacity to support the people who are most affected by these crises, whether that's women, frontline workers, health providers, et cetera. And in the countries that can afford it, unfortunately, it's benefiting corporates and such. Those who are already privileged are being helped more. So this is definitely something that we need to double down and tackle. So David, back to you.
Certainly do. So yes, I mean, the structural adjustment programs, I don't think they ever really went away. I think they just got rebranded. You look at the package of conditions that in one way or another the IMF has been imposing around the world, or the policy advice, the coercive policy advice that it gives, it's remarkably unchanged. So, they may not talk about the structural adjustment programs. Now the IMF will talk about poverty reduction and growth facility, and the World Bank shifted its language to poverty reduction strategy papers. Who can argue against a strategy for poverty reduction? But actually the ideology and the politics of what they were recommending fundamentally left unchanged. And I see this very acutely now. Look, we've seen some very progressive comments coming out of the IMF quarters, from their policy unit, research unit, from Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director herself. But when you look at what's actually happening on the ground in countries, it's the same package, pretty much unchanged over decades. And we really need to start changing in practice and not just changing rhetorically. It's incredible the capacity that the IMF and the World Bank have for co-opting language. You know, the IMF now talk about gender and climate and inequality as macro critical issues that they really take seriously. But when you look at how they do that, it's always as a sort of as a second level thing and secondary to the fundamental sort of ideology, which is about squeezing the state and opening up the state and dismantling public services, encouraging privatization. You know, when you chronically underfund public services for a generation, and as I say, we've got very clear figures now that show that most countries could relatively quickly get to a point where they could double investment in health and in education and water and stop this playoff between different services. But when you underfund for such a long time, there are two big effects. One is that you pass the burden onto women through unpaid care and domestic work that passed on to women, massive increases in that. And then you have accelerated privatization, those who can afford to pay opting out of public services and slowly dismantling the belief that public services, that quality public services are possible. And that has a really long-term lasting damage. You end up with services that are stratified based on your ability to pay. And when you apply that to something like education, which is the thing which I understand perhaps most closely, it's disastrous, because if your ability to get access to quality education depends on your ability to pay to different levels of access to private schooling, then you're undermining one of the fundamental purposes of education that should be to equalize society, to contribute to a more, you know, there's a huge equalizing potential to investment in education, but it's fundamentally undermined when you no longer regard education as a public good, but as a private good, which people need to pay for. And I think that there's a long way to go for changing that. The way we will achieve change, and one of the reasons why I'm really optimistic is what I've seen in the last year, I think is an incredible coming together of different constituencies. Those people who are working in defense of public services, the public sector unions, the feminist organizations, those people working on tax justice and fiscal justice, youth movements increasingly coming to the table, human rights organizations, talking to each other, and environmental organizations as well, coming together and building common platforms. And if you're going to fundamentally challenge some of the most powerful institutions that there ever have been, the sort of post-colonial architecture around the IMF and the World Bank, which with the decision-making is still dominated by the US government, US Treasury, who have 17.5% of the votes on the IMF for any fundamental change, and you need an 85% majority to win a strategic vote. The IMF completely controls it. This is not going to change by changing that. We need pressure from below, and it needs to be coordinated, cross-sectoral, cross-constituency, and that's happening. And ironically, one of the side effects of COVID is we've got better at doing that. We're able to talk to more people in more different places, in more sectors than has been the case before. So there's some cause for optimism.
Great, thank you. That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much. We've run out of time. So thank you to my friend Margie, to Anna, and others who organized the conference for this invitation. Thank you to Tinebeb, David, and Mandeep for joining me today for this conversation. And thank you, everybody, for your attention and your questions today. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.